Hi, everybody. It's Tyler Rust for United States History to 1877. This is part of the studydojo.thinkific.com course that I'm running to help students and teachers of this time period to navigate how to teach and what are some amazing lessons to be learned from the first half of United States history. And today we're rounding out the course with Module 5. This is Session 5, the last of 5 sessions, and we'll be covering the discussion questions for the 5th module, which goes over chapters 13, 14, and 15. So we'll try and jump right in, and I'll be sharing these with you in advance of our face-to-face session, so that you can get an understanding of what the context is around this, and ultimately come prepared to share your own ideas in these discussion questions, because it's really all about you and what you have to share. So the first chapter we're looking at in Module 5 is Chapter 13, and Chapter 13 is called The Sectional Crisis. It is the chapter just before the outbreak of violence in the Civil War, and it contains some of the more interesting and dramatic stories from the era. And one of my favorites is John Brown and his raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. This is, I think, an amazing event for an educator to use in their course because of John Brown's very debatable significance. Obviously, he was very significant to some. He was less significant to others. Some see him as a martyr to the cause of abolitionism. Others see him as a madman who took up arms against his own government. And in that sense, as a historian, I love John Brown because he offers so many starting points for discussion that can reveal the real value and impact history can continue to have on us today. So I'll go into more about John Brown when we have our face-to-face session, but the discussion questions for Chapter 13, the sectional crisis, are: how did conflict over states' rights contribute to sectional conflict? As the country expanded more and more, what we're seeing is that the right of a certain state to be a free territory or to have slaves became one that impacted all the other states more and more in the 1850s. Laws like the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which was part of the Compromise of 1850, ultimately allowed for slavery to exist even in free territories and states, which would have greatly angered many of the abolitionists Northerners. It also was sort of a deal breaker. You had to have a fugitive slave law or the South would secede, because they were continuing to struggle as more and more slaves would run into a free territory and claim that they were free. And there's a great example of this being the Dred Scott case, which I think has an even more profound economic lesson than just the political or legal one. And the Dred Scott decision is, I think, required learning for this chapter, something that I would require all of my students to understand, because it was perhaps the worst Supreme Court decision, but also very revealing about what it says about the Constitution when it comes to slavery. The second question for Chapter 13, the sectional crisis, is: why did the South secede? And this is an important question because, sadly, it remains one of debate today. And that is, I guess, sad in the sense that it shows we don't really understand our history, or it shows the failure of history education in this society. But I think it can also be seen as a benefit to an educator if you look at this question as one that reveals very much the regionalism that continues today and the difficulty and importance of teaching history, in that if you have different answers to this question, why did the South secede, you could have a very different view of what nation you're living in. What is the United States if we understand the Civil War differently based upon where we live? And that's a great question for you to present to your students or for you to ponder for yourself, because when we misunderstand or have different understandings of such a fundamental moment in American history as the Civil War and why it happened, it can lead to gross misunderstandings going forward about what it means to be an American and what course this country should take. And I think we're seeing a lot of that play out today with debates around Confederate monuments and statuary, as well as re-examining what we celebrate from American history. So that's chapter 13. Chapter 14 is about the Civil War. This is where the war and all of the details and battles and strategies and characters come to life for us. There's a lot here. This would be a chapter I would think you'd take more time on, either as a student or as a teacher, guiding your students through this material. It's one that I think allows for a lot of individual projects and student-based research, either around the characters, the strategies, the causes, or the effects. The Civil War is perhaps one of the most important, if not the most important event in U.S. history, because its fundamental questioning about what this country is all about. The questions for us, however, are maybe a little bit more approachable in a short video like today. The question is, who freed the slaves? Now, this one may seem obvious. It might be Lincoln. Well, that would be one we could point to, but I would caution you to not just necessarily jump over this and say, well, it's obviously Lincoln, but to take the opportunity to consider all of the people who were involved in emancipation, not just Abraham Lincoln. Also to note that the Emancipation Proclamation is not what freed the slaves. It was a limited document, and explaining why the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves is, I think, an important lesson in critical thinking and the nuances of history that we should relate to all our students. Understanding how Lincoln felt he did not have the legal authority to free slaves in regions that were not in rebellion shows not only an understanding of the federal system, but also the impact of the Dred Scott decision, and how Lincoln, being a lawyer by training, understood that he only had powers as described under the law and by the courts. And so he did not free all the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. Furthermore, it also is an opportunity to see Lincoln as commander-in-chief and his strategies to fighting the war, and why the Emancipation Proclamation did not free slaves in territories like Maryland and Kentucky and Missouri, because those states had slaves and were essential border states for the Union to maintain their loyalty. Lincoln did not want to lose Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri because he had freed their slaves, so he didn't. And that was a strategic call as well as a legal one by Abraham Lincoln. Then it comes down to the question of all of the other actors who helped to pass the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which has to be understood as the official legal emancipation of all slaves. And you need to introduce Thaddeus Stevens and the Radical Republicans as part of that movement. So it gets to be a very big question. There is an important primary source exercise that I'll share with you on our face-to-face session that you can use to guide the students through this question of who really freed the slaves. And we can't count out the slaves themselves. To what extent did they free themselves from slavery? Now, the second question for chapter 14 is, why did the Union win the war? Now, the why is interesting. Why did the Union win the war? What was it that caused them to ultimately succeed on the battlefields of the Civil War? Was it the Anaconda Plan, like the image I'm showing you here? Was it Sherman's march to the sea? Or was it something more fundamental, like the manufacturing base that they could overproduce or outproduce the South, the population advantage that they enjoyed, so that after bloodbath after bloodbath after bloodbath, the North still had more people that they could throw into the fight, and the South simply didn't. So all of these things are wonderful aspects of this question that should be brought up to determine your understanding or the understanding of your students about the nuance of this question. Because, and I really have to emphasize this, there's no one right answer here. This is how history gets made. This is what historians do. They collect all of these different elements and then they make judgments. And emphasizing the need to make a judgment about history is teaching students about what it is to use history, that history isn't just a bunch of names, dates, and places, one-word answers, or multiple choice questions, that it's actually a craft, an art that you create based upon your nuanced understanding of the many different aspects that go into answering each of these very important, essential questions about what it means to be American. The last chapter, chapter 15, is where I think all of these skills that I'm describing build toward. The chapter on Reconstruction is chapter 15, and Reconstruction is equal in my mind to the importance of the Civil War, because, and it's almost tragic that there have to be separate chapters because they're so intertwined. Reconstruction really represents a lesson for us even now, and that's also why history is so valuable. It helps us to understand our current situations and guides us in making choices about our future. And Reconstruction shows us that how you win the war and how you win the peace is almost more important than why you even fought the war in the first place. Because all of the reasons why you fight a war mean nothing if you lose the peace. If you do not win a war the right way, you might actually lose the war that you won on the battlefield. Right? There are many battles in a war, but the ultimate victory is much bigger than any one battle. And I think in Reconstruction we see that. We see that with with the way that African American freedmen were treated during Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, and how the South was redeemed by white supremacy, and those freedoms that the freedmen enjoyed were lost for another 100 years. And that is the lesson, that if you don't win the war the right way, if you don't win the peace, you can lose the war you fought and won for another 100 years. Now, it doesn't mean we shouldn't take time to celebrate the wonderful achievements that occurred during Reconstruction, but also dig into the failures of Reconstruction. So the first question here is, why did Reconstruction end? In this sense, I think it points out a lasting lesson that we can learn about the will of the political will, the social will, and the economic will of the American people, as well as the limitations of the federal government to affect change in the hearts and minds of the American people, or any people anywhere. That you cannot legislate goodwill, as they say, and this lesson needs to be understood, because I think too oftentimes young students might think, well, if you pass a law, that makes it right, or that ends the debate. When in fact, that's really just the beginning of the task. Passing a law, creating an amendment, or creating something like the Freedmen's Bureau doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It just begins to address it. And that's where the real challenge can begin. The challenge of sharecropping, the challenge of voting rights, the challenge of how do you reintroduce former Confederate states into the Union when these people had just days or weeks or months before been killing American soldiers. What does that mean? How do you evaluate loyalty? All of these are really big questions that could be discussion-based questions, small group questions, or even individual projects that you could have diving deeper into Reconstruction. So Reconstruction for me really ends in 1877 when there's an economic downturn because of the economy and an election that is undecided. With the election of 1876, Grant's second term is over, and there is sort of an undecided outcome to the election of 1876, and Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president because he promises to remove the military from the South, gaining the votes and support of southern states by promising to end it. So economically, the American people didn't feel they could continue by supporting Reconstruction. Politically, there was no will to continue after the 2 terms of the Grant administration. And socially, Americans had moved on from focusing so much and for so long about equality for African Americans. They had moved on to more economic interests that begin to dominate the country after the Civil War. And so that reveals that there are eternal principles that we hold dear, but short-term passions that can fade around those principles. The last question, the second and last question, and the very last question for the course is, was Reconstruction a success or a failure? And in many ways it was a success, and in many ways it was a failure. The lasting success of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments can be described that way because they give the legal basis for the modern civil rights movement and the continual addressing of freedom and equality for minorities in our country, that those fundamental changes that allow for this problem, this inherent American problem to be addressed, could be described as a success. Also, the creation of historical Black colleges and Black churches that give rise to a new leadership class of African Americans is an essential success. And expanding citizenship and voting rights to African Americans can't be understated, even though they were denied for so long by white supremacists who redeemed the South. And therein lies the failure. The rise of the KKK, the redemption of the South by white supremacy, the passage of Black codes and Jim Crow laws, all of that has to be seen as a failure. And the fact that African Americans were of little improved situation economically, socially, or politically once Reconstruction ends in 1877. It really begs the question, not so much did Reconstruction fail, but did the Civil War itself fail? So with that, we could go on for a long time, and I hope to dive deeper with you into these discussion questions when we have our final session for module number 5, covering chapters 13, 14, and 15. So I'll try and keep it brief, and I look forward to talking with you more in depth on these questions. Thank you.